Hello and welcome to today's ACM Learning webinar. I'm Jeremy Epstein, Lead Program Officer at the National Science Foundation's Secure and Trustworthy Cyberspace, SATC program. I'm also an ACM Senior Member as well as Chair of the Voting Committee of the ACM U.S. Public Policy Council. This webcast is part of ACM's commitment to lifelong learning and serving the more than 100,000 computing professionals and students who are ACM members. Before we get started with today's presentation, Navigating Cybersecurity and Public Policy, 6 Key Issues by my friend Dr. Herb Lin, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping items shown on the slide in front of you. You can enlarge the slides using the button in the top right corner of the screen or by dragging the corner of the slide window. The slides will automatically advance throughout the event. To control volume, please adjust the master volume on your computer. At the end of our presentation, we'll have time for questions. If you think of a question during the presentation, please type it into the Q&A box and click the Submit button. You do not need to wait until the end of the presentation to begin submitting questions. You may also use the Q&A box to suggest topics for future webinars. This session is being recorded and will be archived. You will receive an automatic email notification when it is available, or you can check learning.acm.org in a few days for updates. If you are experiencing problems with the web interface, please refresh your console by pressing the F5 key in Windows, or Command-R if you're on a Mac, or refresh your browser on a mobile device, or of course close and relaunch the presentation. You can also visit the webcast help guide by clicking on the Help widget below the side window. Go to the next. Excuse me. It's my pleasure to introduce Herb Lin, who is Chief Scientist at the Computer Science and Telecommunications Board at the National Research Council of the National Academies, where he has been Study Director of major projects on public policy and information technology. His projects have also included a number of studies related to cybersecurity, which are listed in the bio panel of your webinar console. Prior to his NRC service, he was a professional staff member and staff scientist for the House Armed Services Committee from 1986 to 1990, where his portfolio included defense policy and arms control issues. He received his PhD in physics from MIT. Herb, it's my pleasure to introduce you, and I look forward to your presentation today.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. What we're here to talk about is a briefing based on an Academy, National Academy's report, namely this one, which is available for free in PDF form and available for money at the National Academy's website. So this report is a report that builds on a lot of other work by the Academies on cybersecurity over the last 20-25 years or so, and it's essentially a primer on fundamental concepts and principles of cybersecurity and how they interact with public policy. So what we're going to talk about today is sort of basics of what is cybersecurity and why does anybody care, what are some policy approaches that will help to improve security, and go over something about the findings from the report. Many of you in the audience will know much of what I'm about to say, but what's important in this report, I think, is a judgment about what the fundamentals are. That is, your mileage may vary about specific content and so on, but we think that what's going to be presented here is sort of it underlies many of the difficulties that we're facing in public policy. So why should we care about public policy, about cybersecurity? Well, first we need to think about what cyberspace is, and then what cybersecurity is, and then trying to understand how those things connect to the public policy debate. So we talk about cybersecurity, about cyberspace as 3 elements, basically. It's artifacts that are based on or dependent on actual physical hardware. This is what we would generally call electronics. Of course, there's photonics involved, but never mind that for the moment. And then information, data, and programs that these artifacts use, store, handle, and process. And of course, an important part of cyberspace is how all of these elements are connected. So it's hardware, software, and the interconnections between them. And so what's included in it are things that everybody uses overtly, explicitly, that you know about, the internet and Google and Facebook and so on, all those sorts of things. There, your iPhone is on it, your laptop, the electric power grid is on it, and fly-by-wire airplanes are on it, and drive-by-wire cars are on it, and your refrigerator is going to be on it, and chemical plants and the metro and so on. All of these physical systems are increasingly using information technology, and they count as cyberspace as well. Now, what is cybersecurity? Cybersecurity is the prevention and reduction of the negative impact of bad things in cyberspace that can happen as a result of deliberate actions against information technology by a hostile actor. That is, it has to be deliberate. If it's just accidental, if it's nature and so on, that's a question of reliability. We're worried about deliberate actions. What are some questions at the nexus of cyberspace, cybersecurity, and public policy? Well, you'll see the questions on the right. How much reduction or prevention is enough? Who decides? What counts as a negative impact? Who owns the information technology? What makes an actor malevolent? All those kinds of questions are questions that can't be answered just technically. They are all questions that relate to public policy. So, one very interesting question that comes up in this is that if you ask somebody, what's the scope of Internet security, some people will say just the connections, and some other people will say everything. So the connections are what technologists usually say. But the layperson, he just wants the thing to work and doesn't care about what the origin of the problems might be. Okay. So why are policy people concerned about cybersecurity? Well, there's lots of things that can happen here. There's cybercrime, there's a loss of privacy, there's activism, appropriation of intellectual property, and so on. Well, why do I mention activism? Well, for many public policy leaders, activism in the population is a concern, and some activists deface websites and so on. There are a lot of other activists who don't do that, but that's the kind of, I wanted to reflect some of the concerns that policymakers have. There's espionage, there's denial of service, there's destruction of physical property and critical infrastructure. There can be a loss of public confidence. We worry about, public policy worries about that as well. Understanding the threats, vulnerabilities, and risks here. What are the major types of threats? There are really fundamentally two types of threats. There's exploitation and attack. Exploitation is the exfiltration of information, violates confidentiality. That is, you want information to stay confidential, and it isn't. And then attacks, which are, sorry, there's a typo there. Attack is not the unauthorized exfiltration of information, but it does include denying availability of service and destroying or damaging information stored in or transiting through those networks. And such actions could cause physical damage as a result. We worry about the different kinds of vulnerabilities that occur because we have people, systems, components, and connections. People, of course, are the things that are the entities that operate these systems, and these systems operate on behalf of the people involved. And people, as you know, are of course a weak link in this, because you can compromise users. Systems are collections of components. Even if you have a secure component, the system may not be secure components, plural. The system may not be secure, and the components themselves may not be secure, individually secure as well. And of course, the connections themselves also include sort of interesting vulnerabilities. This next slide here is a page stolen from a paper by David Clark. It's in the book. This is what everybody on this call has viewed a web page before. They've done something. But this is just some example of all of those things, all of the things that have to work properly in order to view a web page on your computer. And you can see it's a very busy slide. I don't intend to go over it. But the point here is that every one of those boxes points to something that could go wrong. Next slide here. So who's an adversary? An adversary is somebody who takes advantage of some vulnerability in a system, takes some unfriendly action that will screw up with the ultimate purpose of conducting a cyber exploitation or a cyber attack. Now, the terminology is that adversaries conduct hostile cyber operations, and when the good guys do the same thing, we're conducting offensive operations. So we're not hostile when we're the good guys in doing this. Do we know what the adversary is trying to do? Well, one of the problems in all of this is that an attack and an exploitation may be indistinguishable. That is, if you're the victim of an exploitation, you may well and reasonably think it's an attack, and that could have serious consequences. To date, there has been no known cyber attack that's resulted in death. Malfunctions have caused death, but no known attack. And some attacks have caused damage or loss to property, most well known of them being Stuxnet. Who are the possible adversaries? They span a very wide range from the lone hacker, criminals, organized crime, terrorists, nation states. Nation states are in particular are a high-end threat. They have the money and the talent and the time and support of intelligence agencies and so on to conduct very, very serious threats. There's also out there, you should pay attention to the fact that there are for-hire hacking services. So this decouples the bad intent from the technical skill needed. So if you want to conduct a cyber attack against somebody, you just go and buy the services. And of course, we worry about inside threats as well. There are 6 ways that we thought of to improve cybersecurity. And I want to talk a little bit about each of them. No, I'm going to go back. Sorry about that. The first is reducing the reliance on IT. If you don't, for example, if you don't need an internet connection, don't use the internet. Detection refers to knowing that you've been hacked. It's better to know that you've been hacked rather than not knowing that you've been hacked, because at least that way you can conduct some sort of damage assessment. Defense, this is where a lot of cybersecurity work gets done. It's hardening your system, making them more bug-free, designing them from the start to be more resilient, more resistant to attack. This is the bigger and thicker and higher walls approach. Sometimes those walls don't work, and then you have to worry about recovery and resilience. That is, what do you do when the bad guy gets in? Can you make your system gracefully degrade? Can you recover your system easily? Then you can also conduct offensive operations for defensive purposes. You can retaliate against an attacker. You can disrupt him. You can preempt him before he tries to do an attack. And then you can conduct offensive operations to weaken your adversaries. You might want to gather intelligence. You want to sabotage them, build your military capacity, all those sorts of things. Now, whether or not any of these things are the right thing to do, that's a very interesting question, and that's this question of which there's no consensus on, and so we're not going to talk about that, but the book does talk about that. Let's see. One of the most important lessons of the report is that cybersecurity is much more than just technology. Economics plays a major role in shaping cybersecurity policy. Cybersecurity and policy has to be cognizant of that. Psychology is very important. Social engineering is all based on deception and the like. It's also important in formulating usable security, that is, security measures that people can actually use. And people, of course, in cyber decision-making positions operate under large degrees of uncertainty, and those are, of course, are psychological processes. The organization of how a place is organized matters. Responsibility, authority, red teams, and so on. Now, all of those issues matter in how robust your cybersecurity posture is. So if you have to worry about security policies, you have to worry about your personnel and how reliable they are, and so on. What policy approaches will help improve security? Well, we have the fact that the marketplace has not provided adequate cybersecurity for the country. That is, it's given us a certain level of cybersecurity, certainly better than it was many years ago, but the level of cybersecurity for the country is not adequate for national needs. Many reasons for this. Decision makers discount future possibilities, so they don't see need for action today. Costs are immediate, benefits are far in the future, and doing nothing there's a cost to that, but is not borne by the relevant decision makers. There are many approaches proposed to deal with the market failure in cybersecurity. There are many public sector mechanisms, marketplace mechanisms, and so on. Regulations, liability, direct regulation, international agreements, voluntary industry mechanisms, insurance, trusted suppliers, a whole range of stuff. There's a downside to all of them. All of them are controversial. To illustrate some of that, people often talk about information sharing to enable a coordinated response to a large-scale cyber assault. Well, people worry about antitrust there. They worry about privacy issues there, and so on. Blocking malware. If you block malware, how do you know it's malware? That potentially violates privacy. Do you want to do strong authentication to know who's coming at you? Well, that may limit free expression and anonymity. If you want to have a rapid cyber response, that may impact due process. All those are going to be regarded as civil liberties issues. Innovation is another question here. Cybersecurity and innovation are arguably at opposite ends of a spectrum. They push against each other. Putting in security adds to the complexity, the time, the cost, and so on. It interferes with performance and functionality. Consumers often don't really care about it compared to the actual thing that they're trying to do with their information technology. And it often makes your system harder to use. If you integrate security from the start, you can be screwed because often you throw away your first attempt and you start over again, and that's often a problem. That means you account for the cost, you pay the cost upfront, and you haven't bought anything for it. International policy issues. There are a slew of international policy issues. Internet governance. So, for example, does internet governance mean just assigning domain names to IP addresses, or does it include content regulation? This is a big dispute internationally. Disputes are often over content regulation in the name of internet security. So this is, for example, where you get into packet-level authentication issues and so on. Really the people who are advocating that are advocating strong authentication so that they can track down would-be anonymous speakers. Surveillance issues. Should you be weakening cybersecurity to facilitate surveillance? This is one of the issues that has come out in the various leaks on the internet about the internet security and so on. Should they be weakened in order to promote national security? And does it promote national security? Is it possible to limit access to the weaknesses that you do introduce? Those are all big public policy questions here. There are questions of norms of behavior in cyberspace. Should we be allowing spying? What kinds of spying are allowed in cyberspace? The U.S. makes a distinction between cyberspace spying for national security purposes and for economic purposes to benefit companies. Is that a legitimate distinction? We think it is. The Chinese don't. Is it possible to engage in arms control in cyberspace? Well, big debates over that. How do you secure a global supply chain for information technology? How do you make sure that all the components in your computer system work properly? And then there's the role of offensive operations in cyberspace. Under what circumstances should we attack other parties in cyberspace? Should we conduct espionage against them? When is that appropriate? Okay. We have 6 findings in the report. Is there a fix in the future? Answer, no. It's a never-ending battle, and there's not going to be any permanently decisive solution to this. The bad guy needs to succeed only once, and he will get in. Okay. Nevertheless, there is value in improving cybersecurity because that way you help protect you do reduce the loss that you might suffer. For example, yes, he may eventually get in, but he has time and he has limited resources too. And if he's coming after you and you're well defended, he may go off to someplace else, or he'll spend resources on that. And be less able to attack you. Two kinds of cybersecurity improvements can be had. One, we should do what we know already how to do broadly, and the second is we need to come up with new things that we need to do. Let's see. What are the trade-offs? Sorry. What will promote accountability? There are questions here about promoting a sense of urgency and ownership in cybersecurity as a whole. We don't know how to do that yet. Certainly, what's been done to date doesn't address that. On this question of you have to realize that this is probably the most important slide in the deck. That cybersecurity is important to the country, but the United States has other interests as well, and some of those other interests conflict with the imperatives of cybersecurity. So they're going to be trade-offs. And the last point is that offensive operations in cyberspace is an instrument to advance U.S. interests. Lots of important technical legal policy questions which have yet to be aired publicly by the U.S. government. So with that, I'm only a minute or two over, and more information is available here, and I'm done. Jeremy, it's back to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Herb. That was very exciting. Just as we were getting ready to go live, the Supreme Court ruled that police may not search the cell phones of criminal suspects upon arrest without a warrant, which affects privacy. How do you think that change will affect policymakers and views of technology in the United States and perhaps overseas?
I think that the privacy advocates will rejoice at that. I haven't seen the decision, of course, but I had heard about it. They will rejoice at that, and law enforcement agencies will be mad about it, but they will adapt. So.
Do you think that there's a role for the government in policy to create stronger standards? The questioner asks that the government got in trouble with gossip, which us old-timers remember was the government's attempt to create a networking standard, of course, is irrelevant at this point. What do you think is going to happen? Is the government policy going to have an impact?
Well, certainly there are cybersecurity standards that the government has made a big difference in. For example, the crypto standards promulgated by the U.S. government under NIST have been an important aspect of commercial cybersecurity. Of course, the worries now about the compromise of the standards making process has thrown a curveball into that, and nobody knows how that one's going to play out. Certainly, I think that one could argue that there's a question of public trust that has at least been called into question now. Public trust has been called into question by some of the revelations, and how we recover from that is going to be a public policy issue in the future.
Mm-hmm. To what extent do you believe that having decision makers who are not technologists has influenced the lack of cybersecurity? I've heard this comment with respect to the President's Commission looking into the Snowden results. For example, some people are saying the Supreme Court decision this morning on cell phone searches implied that a screen lock is comparable with strong encryption. Clearly, Supreme Court justices are not technologists. How does this affect decision making, and what can we do to improve that?
Well, I'm all in favor of public policymakers getting more expertise in technology. That's part of why we wrote this book. But in the end, the technologist has to appreciate that the people. One of two things: either the public policy person needs to learn more about technology, which the technologists can provide him with, but they have lots of other things on their plate too. And the second thing is that more technologists should get involved in the process. There are many programs for technologists to be involved in the public policy process. The ACM sponsors many of those efforts, and there are many ways for technologists to get involved in the public policy process. Some of them even run for office.
Mhm. I would be remiss if at this point I didn't make a plug for the ACM Public Policy Committee, USACM, and I would encourage people to look that up. Any ACM member can be a participant in that. You don't need to have any special nominations. Just you can nominate yourself. So a questioner asks, what role do hacking conferences such as DEF CON play in cybersecurity policy? And I'll add to that, do the cybersecurity research conferences, for example, I'm at the workshop on the economics of information security today. What role do those have in shaping public policy?
Well, the hacking conferences do often bring to attention a lot of things that would otherwise not be publicized, and they often get a bit of news. And to the extent that you can get mentioned in the mainstream media, there's something really important there. It brings attention to the public policy community about important developments and so on. Efforts like WISE and the various research conferences and so on are also very important. They help advance the state of knowledge, and advancing the state of knowledge is a good and important thing. Now, for example, how you get research on economics in cybersecurity adopted by the public policy process is problematic, but getting anything adopted by the public policy process is problematic. And so it's a long slog, and there are many ways of approaching it. As I said, getting involved with the public policy process is one way of doing it.
Could you say more on cybersecurity in the energy sector? What are the specific large issues, and what are the facets of national security in energy?
Probably the most important one from my standpoint is security of the electric grid, which is vulnerable in many ways. There are individual vulnerabilities that can take down individual stations and so on. Perhaps a bigger worry is collapsing the grid over a large area that would infect hundreds of millions of people. That's really the sort of thing that we worry about. There are studies underway to figure out how best to ameliorate the vulnerabilities there, but it's an unsolved issue at this point.
Mm-hmm. The big tech companies have in recent years started hiring lobbyists and setting up lobbying offices in Washington, people like Google and Microsoft that historically stayed away from Washington. So what are the roles they're playing, both positively and negatively, with respect to cybersecurity policy, and have they had impact?
They've certainly had impact, some impact, although in Washington the public policy process depends on many inputs, so it's hard to say that this particular effort by this particular company made this particular difference. You can't say that. But they certainly had an impact. They bring their commercial concerns as businesses to the attention of public policy makers, and public policy makers do pay attention. So, for example, many American IT companies, big IT companies, are trying to figure out what to do in the wake of the recent revelations about surveillance and so on, and are pushing back on the U.S. government now in ways that they didn't before. They're also doing technological fixes to their systems to make them less vulnerable to compromise. And who would be doing the compromise? Well, it used to be China and Russia, and now maybe they have a more expanded version of what they think the threat space is.
So does that mean that there's no hope for getting a worldwide consensus on solving some of these cybersecurity problems, or can we get bilateral actions?
Well, it's always going to be easier to get bilateral consensus than it is to get multilateral consensus over 150, 200 nations. But is it going to be hard? It's a very, very hard question, right? The United States believes believes in free speech, for example, to a much greater degree than any other nation in the world. I mean, if you take the free speech continuum, we're over at one end of it, and other nations are put more restrictions than we do on it, at least overtly. And getting them to agree with our point of view on that, well, that's going to be mighty hard. And that's, of course, just one example.
Hmm. So related to that, why do U.S. policymakers think there's a distinction between espionage for economic reasons and commercial advantage versus espionage for national security? Is there a firm ground for making that distinction?
I think that when I've spoken to senior policymakers about this, they've essentially cited principles about free trade and letting the market decide and being pro-capitalist and so on. But they're saying that they don't want government intervention in the marketplace in the ways in which that's contemplated. That's been the rationale. Now, whether or not that's a sustainable rationale in the wake of all the other nations that do this, don't know. The other reason that we refrain from giving secrets to U.S. companies is, let's say we found out secrets from another nation. Which U.S. company would we give them to? And if we give them to Company A, Company B will sue the United States government saying, why didn't we get that too? So that gets to be a mess.
I want to go back to the question of professionals and what we should be doing. Cybersecurity is obviously a controversial political topic. To what extent should computing professionals advocate for specific policy positions in the same way that many scientists advocate for specific policies on climate change?
They're citizens just like everyone else, and they should play a role in this. They should have their voices make their voices heard through USACM and the Public Policy Group, and they should lobby Congress and all of those sorts of things. Absolutely, they have a role in this. What's really bad about the business these days, from my perspective, is that too many computing professionals, in particular, say, oh, it's government. I don't want to have anything to do with it. Well, what's going to happen is the government's going to make decisions without your input. Now, it may seem as though that if you try to give them your input, they make decisions without your input as well. But at least by speaking up, you have a chance of being heard. If you shut up and avoid the process, there's no chance you'll be heard.
One comment I'd make from my personal experience that may surprise people is it's a little bit difficult sometimes to have an impact at the federal level, but at the state level it's amazingly easy to have an impact. So few people, especially technologists, interact with their state governments and their state legislators and governors that one person or a few people can have an amazing impact at a state level and build a consensus from there to make things happen at a federal level. I've personally done that and had an impact, and other people may want to do likewise. Let me, I think we've about run out of time, but let me give you a chance to make any final comments, and then we'll thank the listeners for joining us today.
No, the moral of this story is get involved in any way. Jeremy's right that states are a great place to have some action. And for example, with the electric grid, there are 50 public utility commissions, all of whom care about the electric grid. So you can plug in there, no pun intended.
Great point. So thanks very much for leading our discussion today, Herb. We've run out of time, but I do want to thank you for the presentation. I want to encourage our listeners to download your very informative book. It is free, and actually we should have put that link up on the
And there's
on the site.
Right. The link that's up there now is where you can get the free PDF.
Okay, and the slides will be available as a download from the ACM website. Thank you for participating, and this webinar was recorded and will be available online in a few days at learning.acm.org/webinar, and there will be announcements of upcoming webinars and other ACM activities at learning.acm.org and at acm.org. There's also going to be a quick survey where you can suggest future topics or speakers. This is Jeremy Epstein with Herb Lynn. Thank you again for joining us today. Have a great day.
Thank you.